A reading from the book of Exodus. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us, who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought it to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it into a mold, and cast an image of a calf, and they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation." But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth?' Turn your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.'" And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster he planned to bring on his people. Here ends the reading. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. I think we are at a turning point in this story of where the people of Israel are in their journey through the wilderness of Sinai. And really, it's a continuation from the story that began last week with the giving of the Ten Commandments. Last week, Moses went up the mountain, received the Ten Commandments from God, and not only that, but engaged in sort of a constitutional convention, where after the Ten Commandments were given, there is a discussion on a number of laws that regulate how people resolve differences with each other. If you suffer loss at the hands of somebody else or damage at the hands of somebody else, how do you restore what was damaged? What are the limits of that? What are the limits of retaliation? What are the values of restoration for harm to a person, damage to property? And undergirding all of this is really an assumption of simple justice and the consciousness that the people of Israel were once strangers in a strange land. And so they should treat others as they should themselves want to be treated, that they were once slaves and no one deserves to be put into slavery. And so there is in the undergirding of these statutes a real acknowledgement of humaneness and humanity in dealings with people, in their interactions. Well, Moses then comes down the mountain and reads to the people of Israel the Ten Commandments and these other laws. And then they hold a covenant ceremony where they formally adopt these laws as being binding on themselves, that they formally adopt God as their God and say that they will become God's people and follow these rules and ordinances and statutes. After that, Moses pops back up the mountain, and this time he takes the 70 elders with him, as well as other tribal and clan leaders, leaving only Aaron as a leader to sort of keep shepherd over the people of Israel at the foot of the mountain. About halfway up the mountain, Moses goes on up alone, and God and Moses have another lengthy discussion, this time about the formation of the tabernacle, what it's going to look like, what the liturgical furnishings are going to be, what the ceremonies are going to be, what the vestments that Aaron is going to wear are going to look like. And it goes on and on and on. And we get to the point where this chapter begins, where at the bottom of the mountain, the people have experienced Moses and the other leaders being gone for so long that they do not know what to do. They are disoriented. They are discouraged. They are despairing. They see no way forward. And really, they're in the same sort of situation as any other people who are in a period of disorientation, having been unmoored from their past, and yet not yet perceiving where they are going in the future and what the shape of their future is going to look like. And as people are in this period of disorientation, there are a number of very predictable responses that happen. The first response is a desire to just turn around and go back home. And we saw this very early on in the Exodus story, shortly after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea and entered into the wilderness and saw how barren it was and how it lacked resources compared to Egypt, where they lived in the Nile Valley that inundated every year and produced ample crops, abundance, and there was plenty for them to eat, even in slavery. They forgot about sort of the bondage and the harshness and the genocide that they experienced in slavery and saw the scarcity that they saw around them, and immediately said to Moses, "Why did you bring us out here to die? Why can't we just go back to our homes in Egypt and eat the meat and the food and the vegetables that we loved?" Well, of course, that wasn't an option. But we experienced that too as we lived through the first few months of the COVID-19 outbreak. As we went into lockdown, we were anticipating that we'd spend 6, maybe 8 weeks in lockdown, and then we'd emerge, and we would go exactly back to normal. I remember sort of charting out the calendar and looking at that 6 to 8 week period and how it would overlap Easter, and I began saying, let's not worry too much about not being able to gather together to celebrate Easter this year. We'll do it online. But when it's over and we go back into the sanctuary, we will have an Easter service like we've never had before. We will really blow it out and pull out all the stops. And then we'll invite Pivot, for whom we had just had an emergency food drive and other sort of mission initiatives to help them through the initial lack of funding that they experienced at the beginning of the pandemic, and said, and we're going to invite Pivot over and have a grand picnic. And again, we'll just blow it out and it will be great. And it will be a time of celebration for getting back to life as normal and then getting on our own path. We saw the pandemic at the beginning as nothing more than a blip in our lives that would change nothing. How wrong the people of Israel were, how wrong we were. Their journey continued, and so does ours. Here's a second response, and I think this is reflected more in this text. And that is what I call walking forwards by looking backwards. We know we cannot go back. We know there is a future out there. We know the dim outlines of it. We cannot define it. And yet we still carry sort of the memories of our past and what has been important to us. And what we try to do is to amalgamate the best of our past with what we perceive emerging in the future. Again, like trying to walk forwards by looking backwards. And so this is what the people of Israel did. And you have to sort of get over some of the mistranslation, I think, in this text where it reads gods. These are your gods, O Israel, as they create the idol of the golden calf. Actually, the word there in Hebrew is Elohim. It is translated as gods, in plural, or it's translated as God, capital G. It's the same word. And it really depends on context for the way we translate it into English. And I'm convinced that the decision was made long before English translations, that the tradition for the interpretation was God's and not capital G. But if you read capital G, God, this is your God, O Israel, and read the rest of the text in that vein, then it begins to make sense, especially when Aaron says, this is the Lord your God, and he's talking about the golden calf. What's going on is that the people of Israel are taking the forms of worship that they had experienced in Egypt and all the trappings of that, and the idols that are made sort of half human, half animal, or animal altogether, and taking what they're learning from Moses through the Ten Commandments and those other statutes, but they don't have the ability to really interpret what those mean. They've only just received them. They have no idea how to create and live into the reality that those statutes are describing for a particular kind of just and equitable society. And they try to amalgamate all this together and come up with the golden calf. And it's a disaster. We have experienced that too in our disorientation, trying to figure out what we can carry forward with us that has meaning, trying to figure out what the shape of the future is, and trying to amalgamate all that together, and not really getting very far, and ending up with a lot of chaos. And this explains what's going on in our society at large, and why there is so much chaos and confusion. Yet the journey goes on. And from here, the people of Israel go on to another stage, and we see another response to the wilderness, and that is what I call the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. As the people of Israel progressed through the wilderness and it became wearisome, they began to encounter other nations at the edge of the wilderness and began to intermarry with them. And whole segments of the people of Israel in their intermarriage began to move into and settle down in these parallel communities. And we've kind of seen that here as we have struggled with how to reopen, re-enter our buildings, restart programs for the fall in a very different environment. We are perhaps moving a little more slowly than some of our neighboring churches. And like Israel over against the nations that were bordering on the wilderness of Sinai, we need to recognize there is something of a difference between us as a congregation and our neighboring religious communities. I mean, St. Stephen's has opened up for weddings in the sanctuary. Jesse Lee has opened up in some other ways as well. St. Mary's opened up for Mass a long time ago. And, we have to acknowledge that for those traditions, they have a strong sense of a founding era. And much of what they are and what they do is shaped by their founding era. And so they tend to look a little bit backwards, and it's easier for them to begin to restore program and to envision how to restore worship around those things that for them are largely unchangeable than it is for us. I'll give you an example. I grew up in England, in the great cathedrals and abbeys of England, and greatly enjoy high English church music. I love Tallis. And yet, even as much as that liturgy is meaningful for me, when I attend an Anglican or an Episcopalian church service, it feels like I'm in a museum. And that's because our orientation is different. We too have our roots, like the Catholic Church in the 16th century with the Counter-Reformation, or the Anglican Church with the 16th century in the Elizabethan Compromise. Our roots in the 16th century were much more sort of open-ended and future-oriented, and our bumper sticker reads like this: Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda Est, which means, translated from Latin, that the Reformed Church is always reforming. And so we are more of an adaptive tradition than a tradition that looks back to a founding era. Yes, we have traditions like those others that we carry forward, but we are fundamentally a church that looks forward and that adapts to our circumstances. And so in this environment, our natural DNA forces us to be a bit more thoughtful for how we navigate things, not just automatically restoring everything that was in the past and figuring out how to do it in this new environment, but wrestling with who we are becoming. And when you superimpose that, along with the fact that all of our program staff are in interim, plus the sort of hiatus that we are experiencing within the COVID-19 pandemic, that causes us to step a little more carefully, a little more thoughtfully, as we dream about our future. That takes time. It took the people of Israel time. It will take us time. And then there's a fourth response, and that's what I call the shortcut, where, again, the journey becomes so wearisome that it is tempting to say, let's just cut to the chase and get to the end. We hear some of that for ourselves. We saw that in the story of the Exodus. People tired of wandering in the wilderness, decided to go into Canaan all by themselves. And what they saw was frightening, and they came back and scared the people of Israel. And so the wilderness continued, and they had great fear about the land of Canaan because they got there too early. And that happens with us when we are on a journey like this that is long, where still the future is indistinct. Inevitably, there will come to these kinds of communities a person that we call the trickster, the person who offers the shortcut, often a charismatic person who says, follow me and I can get you to where we're going quicker. Every time I have seen one of these personalities arise in a church, it has ended in the same disaster that the people of Israel experienced in trying to push to the promised land too early before they were ready. And so here we are on this journey. It is a journey of interim that is intentional on our part. It is a journey through pandemic that is unintentional on our part, and the parameters of which we cannot really control. But we can, if we take into consideration our tradition and who we are as a people, use this time to reflect, to plan, to dream, to figure out how we need to change to enter a very different environment on the other side of this pandemic and on the other side of this interim from the one we experienced at the beginning. The land of Canaan was vastly different from the land of Egypt, required a different kind of people with a different kind of organization. And we know that this pandemic has accelerated many changes that were already present. But it's going to cause a world that looks very differently on the other side. And we want to be the kind of church that can enter that new world with integrity and authenticity and with a sense of purpose in our ministries and in our priorities and for what we want to accomplish in the name of God. But that requires a vision. And that is really where the story goes next. We can acknowledge the avoidances for the journey, but ultimately, in order to get over our disorientation, we need a vision. And that's where the next story in the text leads us, where Moses asks God, "Show me who you are." Let us wait with patience and discern what God is like, where God is leading us. where God is taking this beloved community and teaching it how to engage in a world that is coming to be. God bless us on this continued journey. Amen.